Margaret had spent half her life protecting the old family house, patching its roof, polishing its floors, and holding together the memories inside it long after her parents were gone. She believed that if she kept the house standing, some part of her family would still remain. But one quiet morning, her younger brother pulled into the driveway with a real estate agent sitting beside him, ready to sell the only thing Margaret had left of the life she gave up. In that moment, standing in the doorway of the home she had sacrificed everything to keep, she realized the fight ahead was never really about money. It was about love, loyalty, and the unbearable pain of discovering that the people who owe you the most can be the first to take what matters most. By the time her younger brother arrived with a real estate agent in the driveway, Margaret Whitmore had already spent nearly 3 hours on her knees, rubbing lemon oil into the front hall floorboards the way her father used to do every October. The house smelled like beeswax, old pine, and the coffee she had forgotten on the kitchen counter. Morning light spilled through the tall front windows and lay in narrow bands across the staircase banister, the same banister Frank Whitmore had sanded by hand the summer Margaret turned 12. She still remembered him standing there in a white t-shirt darkened with sweat, telling her that wood had a memory. If it was cared for, it held on. That morning, the house seemed to hold its breath. Margaret heard Daniel's car before she saw it. He always drove into the gravel with more speed than necessary, as if hesitation were a weakness he refused to admit. She stood slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and looked through the lace curtain in the front room. Daniel stepped out first, tall, expensive coat, quick movement, phone in one hand. Then a woman climbed out after him, carrying a slim leather folder and wearing the polite, careful expression of someone who made a living appraising other people's attachments. Margaret did not know the woman, but she knew exactly what she was. For a moment, she could not move. The cloth in her hand dripped oil onto the polished floor. Her pulse rose so sharply that she felt it in her throat. Daniel had said they needed to talk. He had not said he was bringing someone to measure the house. When the doorbell rang, the sound echoed all the way to the kitchen and back again, through rooms Margaret had spent most of her life protecting from change. The wallpaper in the dining room was still the same faded green Eleanor Whitmore had chosen in 1987. The brass mail slot still stuck in damp weather. The clock over the mantel still lost 3 minutes every week. In all those years, the house had aged the way people did. Imperfectly, stubbornly, and in places that only someone who loved it would notice. Margaret opened the door, and Daniel gave her the smile he used when he was already asking for something. "Morning," he said. Her eyes moved to the woman beside him. Daniel cleared his throat. "This is Karen Duvall. She's just going to take a look around." Margaret stared at him. "You brought a realtor here without asking me?" Karen's smile faded by half. She shifted her folder from one arm to the other. Daniel exhaled, already impatient. "Margaret, we've been going in circles for months. I told you we needed information." "This is not information," she said quietly. "This is a decision." Karen glanced from one face to the other, then looked politely at the porch railing, as if it had become urgently interesting. Daniel lowered his voice. "Can we not do this out here?" But Margaret was no longer embarrassed by the possibility of being heard. That feeling had burned away months ago, replaced by something colder. "You should have called before you brought a stranger to my mother's front door." "Our mothers," Daniel said. The correction landed like a slap. It was not loud. It was not even cruel by ordinary standards. But the words struck exactly where Margaret was weakest, in the aching place between what was legal and what was true. Her grip tightened on the edge of the door. All around them, the morning stood still. The bare maples, the cracked flower pot beside the steps, the porch swing Frank had repaired every spring until his hands no longer steadied enough for a hammer. Margaret looked at Daniel, at the practiced impatience in his face, at the house standing behind her like an old witness, and felt the awful certainty that whatever happened next would not be about square footage or market value. It would be about everything that had been building in this family for 40 years. Margaret was 58 years old, and for so long she had been the dependable one that most people had forgotten there was once a version of her who expected a larger life. In the family, her steadiness had become less a quality than a duty. She was the daughter who remembered birthdays, prescriptions, furnace filters, doctor appointments, and which section of the roof leaked when the rain came hard from the east. She knew where Eleanor kept the spare house keys, where Frank kept the warranty papers, and which kitchen cabinet door had to be lifted slightly before it would close. She knew how to calm her mother when pain made her sharp, and how to guide her father to the bathroom when the weakness in his left side embarrassed him so much he refused to ask for help. By the time both parents were gone, much of Margaret's adult life had disappeared so quietly into those years of caring for them that even she was not always sure where it had gone. The house stood on Hawthorne Street in a western Pennsylvania town that had once been busier, louder, and more certain of itself. When Margaret was a child, the steel plant still employed half the men on the block, and the grocery on the corner had a bell over the door that rang all day long. By the time she was in her 40s, the grocery had become a tax office and then a church thrift shop, and the plant existed mostly in stories told over coffee by retired men who spoke of work the way widowers spoke of first love. Frank Whitmore had not built the house from the ground up, but he had remade enough of it that his hands were everywhere. He added the shelves in the den, replaced the porch posts, laid the tile in the mudroom, and once spent an entire July insulating the attic, because Eleanor had said the upstairs was impossible in summer. He took pride in quiet improvements. Things did not need to be flashy to be worth doing. They needed to last. Eleanor, on the other hand, had believed that a house was less about durability than atmosphere. She wanted curtains that moved in the breeze, polished silver on Thanksgiving, and lilacs beneath the dining room window because her own mother had grown them. She cared whether the lamplight felt warm in the evenings and whether the china cabinet smelled faintly of cedar. If Frank made the house solid, Eleanor made it feel watched over. Margaret grew up inside that combination of order and sentiment. She learned early that every household had its roles, and in theirs, hers became fixed before she was old enough to resist it. She was the older child by 7 years. Daniel came late, unexpected, charming from the start, and the difference between them entered the family like weather, subtle at first, then impossible not to plan around. Margaret was the child sent back inside to get the casserole dish when everyone was already in the car. Daniel was the child waved toward the front seat because he got carsick. Margaret was capable, therefore relied upon. Daniel was sensitive, therefore protected. No one said it aloud. That would have required a level of self-awareness the family did not possess. Instead, it became one of those unwritten truths that shape a household more thoroughly than rules ever could. Margaret grew dependable because dependability was praised. Daniel grew casual because someone always adjusted around him. It would have been simpler if he had been selfish in a clear and uncomplicated way. But Daniel was never that easy to define. He could be careless, but he could also be warm. He forgot obligations, but he remembered people's moods. He called less than he should, but when he was in a room, everyone felt his energy. Even as a boy, He could make Eleanor laugh when she was cross and persuade Frank to soften when Margaret would only have received a lecture. He had the gift of being difficult to hold fully accountable because he never seemed entirely hard-hearted while he was failing someone. That quality followed him into adulthood. Daniel moved to North Carolina at 27 for a sales job, married Rebecca Harris 2 years later, and built the kind of life that looked successful in Christmas cards. There was a wide driveway, coordinated patio furniture, and later a daughter named Lily, whose braces, dance recitals, and college plans became the new focus of every holiday conversation. Daniel visited on Thanksgiving when he could, sent expensive flowers on Eleanor's birthday, and spoke often about meaning to come up more frequently. Margaret remained nearby. For a while she had imagined leaving. In her early 30s, she had been engaged to a history teacher named Paul Denton, a good man with patient eyes and a practical manner. They had looked at apartments in Pittsburgh. They had discussed paint colors. Margaret had once stood in a hardware store choosing cabinet knobs for a kitchen she never got to have. Then Frank suffered his first stroke. It was not catastrophic. Not at first. He recovered speech, some strength, enough dignity to resent assistance. But the stroke changed the math of the family. Eleanor did not drive on highways. Daniel could not relocate. Margaret, who lived only 40 minutes away and had a job flexible enough to permit time off, began staying over a few nights a week. A few nights became most nights. Most nights became all the time. Paul waited longer than many men would have. He did not leave in anger. In some ways, that made it worse. One cold February evening, while Margaret stood at the sink rinsing soup bowls after helping Eleanor settle Frank into bed, Paul said gently, "I don't think there's room for the life we planned anymore." Margaret had looked down at her wet hands and known he was right. After he left, no one in the family spoke much about what she had given up. There was always something more pressing. The next doctor, the next medication, the next emergency. Besides, Margaret herself did not know how to discuss sacrifice without sounding either bitter or theatrical, and she was determined to be neither. She told herself that time had narrowed, not vanished. She told herself she could still build something later. Years passed in that shape. First, Frank declined in steps so gradual that each loss almost resembled adaptation. Then Eleanor fell in the grocery parking lot and began moving with the caution of someone whose own body had become an unreliable floor. After that came appointments, bills, pill organizers, late-night fevers, and the exhaustion that settles not from a single crisis, but from the endless repetition of being needed. Margaret moved back into her childhood bedroom for a little while, and remained for 16 years. By the end, she occupied the room at the front of the house with the slanted ceiling. While her parents had the downstairs bedroom, Frank converted out of the old den when stairs became too much. She worked part-time at the public library, enough to keep income coming and health insurance intact, then rushed home for wound care, paperwork, grocery deliveries, and the constant domestic maintenance that illness never suspends. She learned which heating companies overcharged widows and which plumbers would explain things honestly. She fought insurance representatives, balanced checkbooks, and watched her own life shrink to the size of the property lines without anyone ever formally asking whether she agreed to the exchange. She did it because someone had to. She also did it because the house mattered to her in a way she could never fully explain. Not because it was grand, it was not. Not because it made financial sense. It often did not. But because the house seemed to hold the last clear outline of the family before loss changed all their proportions. In those rooms, She could still hear Frank's boots by the back door, still picture Eleanor at the dining table folding cloth napkins for Christmas dinner, still locate the exact patch of hallway where Daniel once split his chin open, running with socks on polished floors. Memory lived elsewhere, of course, but here it had shape, weight, and door frames. When Eleanor died, the silence in the house became almost physical. The funeral passed in a blur of casseroles, carnations, and tired relatives saying versions of the same sentence. She's at peace now. Margaret accepted hugs, signed paperwork, located Eleanor's pearl earrings for the mortician, and spent 3 days thanking people for things she barely remembered receiving. Daniel came up with Rebecca and Lily. He cried at the church, helped carry boxes from the fellowship hall, and stood at the cemetery with his arm around Rebecca while the wind tugged at everyone's coats. For a few hours, grief made them resemble a united family. Then, the evening after the burial, while Margaret was in the kitchen rinsing coffee cups spotted with lipstick and dried cream, Daniel leaned against the counter and said, "Have you talked to the attorney yet about what Mom put in place?" It took Margaret a moment to understand the question. Her body was so tired she felt slightly removed from it. "Not yet," she said. He nodded, casual. "We should probably find out where things stand. The market's still good in this neighborhood." Margaret turned slowly. The sink water ran over her wrists, gone cold. Daniel was looking not at her, but through the window above the sink, as if he were commenting on weather. "The market?" He looked back, perhaps realizing too late how it sounded. "I'm just saying it's something we'll need to deal with." The room seemed to narrow around the old yellow light over the stove. Margaret shut off the water. "Our mother was buried this afternoon." Daniel shifted his weight. "I know that." "Then maybe wait until tomorrow to discuss selling her house." He opened his mouth, closed it, and lifted both hands in surrender. "Fine. Not tonight." Rebecca appeared in the doorway a second later carrying a stack of folded sympathy cards, her expression already alert to tension. Daniel stepped away, and the moment ended. But something had entered the room with his question, and once there, it did not leave. At first, Margaret told herself she had overreacted. Death unsettled people. It made them practical in awkward ways. Daniel had not been cruel, only abrupt. She knew he had responsibilities back home. Mortgage, tuition, a wife whose patience had limits. She knew, too, that the house was legally part of the estate. Knowing these things did not soften what she felt when she pictured him standing in that kitchen, discussing market conditions while Eleanor's coat still hung by the mudroom door. A week later, Margaret met with Alicia Bennett, the family attorney, in an office that smelled faintly of toner and peppermint tea. Alicia was in her early 60s, composed without being cold, and had helped Frank draft paperwork years earlier after the first stroke. She spoke carefully, as if she knew from long experience that grief made ordinary facts feel accusatory. "There's no dispute about the beneficiaries," Alicia said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Your mother's will was straightforward. Personal effects are to be divided between you and your brother by mutual agreement. The house and remaining accounts are split equally." Margaret stared at her. "Equally?" Alicia nodded, almost apologetically. Margaret had expected some version of fairness. She had not expected law to ignore history so completely. "She knew I was living there," Margaret said. "She did. I cared for both of them." Alicia folded her hands. "I'm aware." Margaret heard the strain in her own voice and hated it. Then why would she do that? Alicia's eyes softened, but she did not answer the question Margaret was really asking. because lawyers rarely could. She may have wanted to avoid conflict, she said. Many parents believe equal is safest. Margaret almost laughed. Equal. The word sat in the room like a badly made piece of furniture, upright but unstable. When she drove home, she gripped the steering wheel so tightly her fingers hurt. She understood, in a rational sense, that wills were blunt instruments. They could distribute property, not measure devotion. Still, something deep inside her had relied upon a private certainty she had never bothered to test. Not that she would be rewarded. She did not think in those terms, but that her parents had seen. That somewhere, in some official and undeniable way, the years would be acknowledged. Instead, the law had placed her sacrifice and Daniel's absence onto a neat scale and declared the weights identical. That was the first crack. The second came quietly, in the months that followed, through a pattern of small humiliations that together formed something much larger. Daniel returned to North Carolina after the funeral and resumed calling every Sunday evening. At first, he asked after Margaret in the gentle voice people use with someone they believe to be grieving more directly than they are. Then the question shifted. Had she spoken to a realtor? Did she know what the taxes would be next year? How much work did the place really need before listing? Margaret answered carefully. The roof still had 5 good years. The boiler had been serviced in January. The upstairs bath needed cosmetic work, but functioned. Yes, she knew the taxes. No, she had not called a realtor. Each conversation ended the same way. Well, Daniel would say, we should keep talking. By Thanksgiving, the phrase itself made her jaw tighten. He came up that year with Rebecca and Lily, and the house was full again for 24 hours. Rebecca brought cranberry bars from a bakery and arranged them on Eleanor's china platter as if performing continuity. Lily, now 20, wandered through the upstairs rooms looking older and softer than Margaret remembered, opening drawers and smiling when she found old photo albums. Daniel stood in the dining room after dinner, wineglass in hand, looking around with the assessing expression of a man trying to translate nostalgia into resale value. It's a good lot, he said. People pay for character now. Margaret, collecting plates, kept her eyes on the table. It has character because someone kept it that way. Daniel gave a short laugh, as if she were teasing. Later that evening, when Rebecca and Lily went to bed, Daniel lingered in the kitchen while Margaret wrapped leftovers. You know this can't go on forever, he said. What can't? You staying here like everything's the same. Margaret placed the foil carefully over a bowl of sweet potatoes. I am not pretending everything's the same. Margaret. No. I live here. I pay the utilities. I pay the taxes. I handled Mom's care. I handled Dad's care before that. If anyone has been living with reality, it's me. Daniel rubbed at his forehead. I'm not saying you haven't done a lot. Done a lot. The phrase was so thin, so inadequate, that for a second she could not respond. He continued, speaking faster now. I'm saying the house is an asset. We can't just leave it floating there because it feels sentimental. Margaret turned to face him. Sentimental. He looked tired, annoyed, perhaps even a little guilty, which only made the moment worse. You know what I mean? I do, she said. That's the problem. There were other moments after that, none dramatic enough to describe later without sounding oversensitive, all painful in their own precise way. Daniel mailed her a printout of comparable home values with 2 listings highlighted in yellow. Rebecca called once to suggest, in an overly bright tone, that a smaller place might be less overwhelming for Margaret now that she was starting a new chapter. Daniel asked whether Eleanor's silver could be sold separately from the house. When the old maple in the backyard dropped a heavy limb after a storm, Margaret paid to have it cut and removed. Daniel objected to the expense until Alicia reminded him that a damaged tree posed liability concerns. At Christmas, he took Frank's watch home, saying their father had once promised it to him. Margaret did not argue, though she remembered no such promise and spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling while downstairs the empty mantel clock clicked like a slow leak. The practical burden remained hers. Estate inventories, donations, repairs, bills, subscriptions that needed canceling, medical paperwork that arrived months after Eleanor's death, as if grief itself were renewable. Daniel helped in the way distant people often help, by expressing support, offering opinions, and assuming someone else would implement them. Margaret continued working part-time at the library, shelving returned books in the quiet hours before opening, then coming home to sort closets, call contractors, and keep the house from slipping into the stale neglect that overtakes places no one is really living in. She was living in it, yes, but increasingly, she felt she was also defending it, against mildew, against paperwork, against her brother's relentless conversion of memory into numbers. What hurt most was not the possibility of losing the house. It was the dawning understanding that to Daniel, the years she had spent preserving it had become merely part of the background, like wallpaper or weather, visible, perhaps even appreciated, but not consequential enough to change what he believed he was owed. In January, Daniel finally said the thing Margaret had feared from the beginning. "If you want to keep it, buy me out." They were on the phone. Snow pressed against the windows. Margaret stood in Eleanor's old bedroom holding a stack of bank statements she had been too tired to file. "With what?" she asked. He hesitated only a fraction of a second. "I don't know. A mortgage, a loan. You've got equity there." Margaret closed her eyes. "Daniel, I'm 58. I work part-time at the library because for 16 years I was taking care of our parents. I do not have the income for a buyout. You've been living there for years without paying rent." The sentence hung between them like a door slammed in the dark. Margaret lowered the phone and looked at it, as if the device itself had betrayed her. Then she brought it back to her ear. "Is that what you think those years were?" Silence crackled on the line. When Daniel answered, his voice was flatter. "I'm saying there has to be a fair arrangement." Fair. That word again. That impossible, bloodless word. Margaret said nothing, and Daniel filled the quiet the way he always did when discomfort threatened him. "Rebecca and I have expenses, Margaret. Lily's tuition went up again. Things are tight. I can't just walk away from my half because you're attached to the place." Attached. She thought of bedpans and blood pressure readings, of sleeping upright in a chair beside Frank's hospital bed, of Eleanor crying from shame after Margaret helped bathe her, of every grocery list, every tax bill, every morning waking before dawn to check whether the furnace had held overnight. Attached. When she finally spoke, her voice was so controlled that even she barely recognized it. "I am not attached to a place. I am attached to what I gave up inside it." Daniel inhaled sharply, as if she had become unreasonable. "You chose to stay." No sentence in her adult life had ever cut deeper. Not because it was entirely false. That would have been easier. Margaret had chosen over and over not to leave. But choice was a complicated thing in families like theirs. It was rarely a clean fork in the road. It was small surrender after small surrender until one path hardened beneath your feet and the other grew over. She ended the call without saying goodbye. For 2 days after that, she moved through the house like someone recovering from illness. She found herself standing in doorways, unable to remember what she had come for. She burned toast. She cried once in the laundry room, unexpectedly and with such force that she had to sit on the closed lid of the washer until the shaking passed. Then she did what she had always done when overwhelmed. She tried to solve the practical problem. Margaret met with a banker in town who reviewed her income, savings, and age with professional sympathy. She could perhaps qualify for a modest line of credit, he said, but not enough to cover Daniel's half at current market estimates. She sold a pair of earrings Eleanor had left her and called about increasing her hours at the library. She even considered taking in a tenant, though the thought of strangers moving through those rooms made her chest tighten. Nothing added up. Meanwhile, Daniel grew more insistent. His calls came midweek now, brisk and increasingly edged with frustration. He had spoken to Alicia. He had looked into the tax implications. He wanted movement. In one conversation, he mentioned, almost accidentally, that his company had cut bonuses that year and Rebecca's mother needed assisted living. Margaret stored the information away, not because it softened her anger, but because it complicated it. Daniel was not inventing pressure. He was simply letting it land where it had always landed, on someone else. In March, he drove up alone and arrived with a folder of printed estimates. They sat at the kitchen table where Eleanor used to sort coupons. Rain tapped lightly against the back windows. Daniel spread pages between them like evidence. Property values, neighborhood comparisons, projected timelines, possible listing prices if they did some cosmetic work first. Margaret looked not at the pages, but at his hands. Frank's hands had been broad and square. Daniel's were finer, quicker, restless. They drummed whenever he was impatient. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked at last. Daniel leaned back. "Do you hear you? You keep acting like I'm trying to destroy something." "You are. It is a house." "No," she said. "To you, it's a house. To me, it's where Mom died. It's where Dad built half the walls. It's where I lived while everyone else got to have a life." Daniel's face changed then, not softening exactly, but tightening around something old. "That's not on me." Margaret stared at him. For a moment she saw not the man in the expensive coat, but the boy who used to disappear whenever dishes needed clearing, who could slip out of tension by making one good joke, who had gone away to build a life no one asked him to interrupt. And suddenly she was no longer interested in being fair or calm. "No?" she said. "Who was it on then? Mom? Dad? Me?" Because somehow every road in this family ended with me being the one who stayed. Daniel's jaw flexed. "I was 27 when Dad got sick. I had a job, a wife, a baby on the way, and I had a life." He flinched, not dramatically, but enough. Rain pressed harder against the windows. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel said, too quietly, "You always make it sound like I ran away." Margaret laughed once, without humor. "You did." Something sharpened in his face. "I left town. That's not the same thing." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum. "You left the work." Daniel rose too. "And you never let anyone forget it." The kitchen seemed suddenly too small for their voices. "Because someone should remember," Margaret said. "What exactly do you want from me?" Daniel snapped. "A medal? A public apology? You think I don't know you did more? Fine. You did more. But that doesn't change what the house is worth." Margaret stared at him, and in that moment the deepest injury was not that he wanted money. It was that he still believed numbers could stand beside years and be discussed in the same tone. He left an hour later with the folder tucked back under his arm, and Margaret stood at the front window watching his taillights vanish into rain. Only after he was gone did she realize her hands were trembling. That night she walked through the house with no destination, touching door frames as she passed, as if taking attendance. In the dining room, the wallpaper had begun to peel behind the radiator. In the upstairs hallway, one floorboard still complained outside Daniel's old room. In Frank and Eleanor's bedroom, the indentation of Eleanor's reading chair remained in the carpet. Margaret stood there a long time, looking at the chair, and understood with sudden clarity that she had spent years preserving not only the house, but a version of herself inside it. The dutiful daughter, the capable one, the woman who absorbed everyone else's needs so quietly that her own became almost theoretical. If the house went, what would remain of that woman? And if the house stayed, what exactly was left for her besides maintenance? Spring came slowly. Hawthorne Street greened in uncertain stages. Lilac buds swelled beneath the dining room window. Margaret planted pansies in the front boxes because Eleanor always had, then felt foolish halfway through and finished anyway. Daniel stopped calling for 3 weeks, which Margaret knew was not peace but preparation. She was right. The petition arrived by certified mail on a Wednesday afternoon in April. She signed for the envelope at the front door, set it unopened on the hall table, and stared at it until the mail carrier's truck turned the corner and disappeared. Something in the thickness of the paper made her already know. Inside were formal notices drafted in Alicia Bennett's careful office language, though another attorney's name appeared at the top. Daniel Whitmore was requesting partition action if an agreed sale or buyout could not be reached within 60 days. Margaret read the page twice and understood only every third sentence. Legal words blurred into one another. Interest, disposition, equitable division, forced sale. The meaning beneath them was brutally clear. Daniel had taken the family's oldest wound and handed it to strangers to sort out. She sat on the bottom stair with the papers in her lap and listened to the house settling around her. Somewhere upstairs, a vent clicked as the heat came on. Outside, a dog barked 2 houses down. The ordinary sounds of a Wednesday afternoon continued with intolerable normalcy, while Margaret's life shifted into something colder and more public. When Alicia called that evening, her voice was grave. "I'm sorry," she said. "I had hoped he wouldn't do this." Margaret looked at the papers again. "Can he?" "Yes." Margaret laughed then, a short, broken sound. "That seems to be the answer to everything." Alicia let the silence hold. "There may still be room to negotiate," she said after a moment. "Sometimes filing is a pressure tactic." "To pressure me into what?" Margaret asked. "Inventing money?" "No," Alicia said carefully. "Into accepting that he intends to proceed." Margaret pressed her fingertips to her eyes. "He already accepted that long before I did." After the call, she walked into the backyard and stood beneath the old maple stump. The evening air smelled damp and earthy. Neighbor children rode bicycles at the far end of the block. Across the fence, June Patterson from next door looked up from clipping dead stems and immediately understood from Margaret's face that something had happened. June had lived beside the Whitmores for 30 years, first with a husband who laughed too loudly, and then alone after his sudden heart attack. She was one of the few people who had seen Margaret's caregiving years up close enough to understand their texture. The way they consumed days not through grand sacrifice but through relentless interruption. June set down her clippers. "You all right?" Margaret shook her head. June came to the fence and waited. She never rushed other people's grief. Finally, Margaret said, "Daniel filed to force a sale." June's mouth tightened. She said nothing for a second. Then, "I'm sorry." Margaret crossed her arms against herself. "I keep thinking maybe I should have expected it. Maybe I did expect it. I just thought—" She stopped. "That he'd remember," June said. Margaret looked at her, and for the first time all day she felt close to tears again. June rested her forearms on the fence. People remember in ways that favor them. That doesn't always mean they're lying. Sometimes it just means memory's selfish. The truth of it landed heavily. "Do you think I'm being unreasonable?" Margaret asked. June did not answer immediately. "I think," she said, "that you gave this family something they got used to receiving for free." Margaret looked away then, because the sentence was too exact. Once the petition was filed, the house changed. Not physically, not yet. But Margaret began to perceive it through other people's future eyes. She noticed the hairline crack in the upstairs bathroom tile, the faded patch of wallpaper behind the clock, the uneven paint along the back porch trim. Every imperfection seemed suddenly vulnerable to judgment. She hated that. She hated imagining Karen Duvall or any stranger walking through the dining room and seeing not Thanksgivings and funerals and years of careful endurance, but good natural light and dated finishes. Daniel called after the filing, perhaps expecting outrage, perhaps fearing it. Margaret let the phone ring 3 times before answering. "I didn't want it to go this way," he said. She almost admired the sentence for its precision. It took no responsibility and requested sympathy at the same time. "No?" she said. "Then which part did you want?" He sighed. "Margaret, please." "No, I'm actually asking. The part where your lawyer sends papers to the house our mother died in? The part where strangers decide what my life here is worth? Which part wasn't what you wanted?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might hang up. Instead he said, tired now rather than defensive, "I needed you to understand. I'm serious." Margaret closed her eyes. "I always understood that. You're the one who never understood anything else." 2 weeks later, the major breaking point came not in a courthouse or attorney's office, but in the kitchen, where most family damage eventually returns. Daniel arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning with Karen Duvall again, this time to discuss pre-listing options, as if legal momentum had already become moral permission. Margaret found them on the back porch when she returned from the grocery store. Karen was measuring the width of the sliding door while Daniel spoke into his phone. For one stunned second, Margaret simply stood there holding a sack of oranges. Daniel looked up, ended the call, and straightened. "You weren't answering." "I was buying groceries," Margaret said. Karen offered a strained smile that made her look pained on Margaret's behalf. "I can come back another time." "No," Daniel said before Margaret could speak. "We're already here." Margaret set the grocery bag down on the porch floor so carefully that one orange still rolled free and bumped against the threshold. She looked from Daniel to Karen and back again. Something in her, stretched past limit for too many months, finally gave way. "You do not get to walk into this house and act like I'm already gone." Daniel's expression hardened. "I'm trying to deal with reality." "You're trying to erase me from it." Karen spoke softly. "Mr. Whitmore, maybe this isn't the best." But Daniel was no longer listening to anyone except the version of himself he was determined to defend. "For God's sake, Margaret, it is not all about you. The sentence rang through the porch and into the kitchen beyond it. Margaret laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Not all about me. I have cleaned this house, paid for this house, nursed people in this house, buried both our parents from this house, and you think I'm making it about me because I don't want you selling it out from under me? Daniel's own voice rose. You're acting like being here gave you ownership of everyone's grief. No, she said. It gave me the bill. Karen stepped back, folder pressed to her chest. Daniel took one step toward Margaret. You think staying made you noble. Maybe it just made you stuck. The words landed with surgical force. For a second, Margaret could not breathe. Then she heard herself say, in a voice so calm it frightened even her, "Get out." Daniel stared. Margaret, get out of my house. It's not your house. She held his gaze. Then get out of the house I kept standing while you were busy having opinions about it. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to argue, perhaps to explain, but whatever he saw in her face changed his mind. Karen put a hand lightly on his arm. Daniel, she said quietly, let's go. He jerked away from the touch, but finally turned. The humiliation of leaving in front of Karen seemed to enrage him further. At the porch steps, he looked back once. You cannot stop this forever. Margaret's throat burned. Watch me stop trying. The door slammed after them. For several minutes, she stood motionless in the kitchen. The oranges remained scattered across the porch. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the house, the old mantel clock marked the half-hour. Then, all at once, the strength went out of her legs, and she sat down hard in Eleanor's chair at the kitchen table and began to cry with the deep, shuddering grief of someone mourning more than one thing at once. She cried for the house. She cried for her parents. She cried for the life that had narrowed around duty until even her right to remain inside the walls of it had to be negotiated. And beneath all that, she cried for the unbearable possibility that Daniel had touched some painful truth, that staying had not only cost her, it had also defined her so completely that she no longer knew who she was, apart from what she preserved. After that day, Daniel did not come back for nearly a month. The silence he left behind was not peace, it was aftermath. Alicia scheduled mediation. Rebecca called once and left a careful voicemail saying she was sorry, things got heated, which only made Margaret angrier. June brought over a casserole Margaret barely tasted. At the library, Margaret reshelved biographies and gardening books, while her mind replayed the porch scene in loops, always returning to the same phrases. Maybe it just made you stuck. It's not your house. You chose to stay. One rainy Thursday in early May, Margaret went into the attic looking for the last box of property records Alicia had asked her to locate. The attic had always belonged more to memory than utility. Frank stored tools there he meant to repair. Eleanor stored Christmas decorations, old school papers, and dresses from a body she no longer had. The air smelled of dust, cedar, and summers trapped beneath shingles. Margaret climbed the pull-down stairs carrying a flashlight and moved slowly between boxes labeled in Eleanor's looping handwriting. Daniel, school, Thanksgiving linens, miscellaneous papers, photos. Near the far wall, behind a broken floor lamp and a carton of Reader's Digest magazines, she found a narrow tin file box she did not recognize. It was locked, though badly, and the latch gave with a firm twist of the screwdriver she kept in her apron pocket. Inside were bank papers, an unsigned deed transfer form dated 6 years earlier, and beneath them a bundle of envelopes tied with blue ribbon. The top envelope had Margaret's name on it in Eleanor's hand. She sat down hard on an old quilt trunk, dust rising around her, and slid the letter free. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then I have done what I always do when I am afraid. I have left the important thing unsaid until it is almost too late to say well. Margaret stopped and pressed the page against her knee. Her breath had gone shallow. Below her, the house was utterly quiet. She kept reading. There are not enough legal papers in the world to explain a family. I know that now. I have tried to make things equal because I thought equal would keep peace. Perhaps that was cowardice. Perhaps I have confused peace with silence for too many years. You stayed when we needed staying. I saw more than I said. That is not the same as saying it, and for that I am sorry. The lines blurred. Margaret wiped at her eyes and forced herself on. Your father wanted to put the house in your name after his second hospitalization. He had papers drawn. I could not agree to it then. Part of me feared Daniel would feel cast out, and part of me feared you would never leave if we made the staying official. I told myself I was protecting both my children. That may have been the story I needed in order to live with what your life had become. If I have done wrong, it is not because I loved you less. It is because I have spent years mistaking your strength for permission to ask more of you. Margaret lowered the letter. The attic seemed to tilt. She looked at the unsigned deed. Frank had indeed started the process. His name was there, his intention clear, stalled only by Eleanor's refusal to complete it. For a moment, anger rose so hot it nearly steadied her. Then she read further. I did not leave you the house because I was not certain the house had been a blessing to you. That sentence stopped her cold. I know what it held for your father. I know what it came to hold for you. But I also know how many times I watched your world grow smaller inside these walls, while I told myself there would be time later. I was selfish enough to hope the house would continue to care for you because you had cared for us inside it. Houses do not know how to do that. They only ask to be maintained. If Daniel pushes to sell, try not to hear only greed. He has always wanted proof that this family did not set him outside the circle just because he left. He will ask in the language he knows best, which is money and motion. He does not understand the house the way you do, but that does not mean he has no wound inside it. I wish I had raised you both differently. I wish I had praised need less and steadiness less carelessly. I wish I had said thank you in a way that cost me something. Love always, Mom. Margaret sat in the dim attic for a long time after she finished, letter in hand, listening to rain tick lightly against the roof. She found more letters underneath, some addressed to Daniel, some never addressed at all, perhaps drafts Eleanor never mailed. There were also copies of checks Daniel had sent over the years after Frank's medical bills increased. Modest amounts with notes like for the roof or use where needed. Margaret had never known about them. Eleanor had deposited the money quietly and told Margaret it came from savings. Another letter, unsent, mentioned Daniel's shame at not being physically present and his habit of compensating with money because it was the only help he could offer from far away, without rearranging the life he feared losing. The discovery did not erase Margaret's anger. It did, however, disturb its cleanest edges. For years she had told herself a simple story. She had carried the family. Daniel had escaped it. The bones of that story were true. But in the attic, with Eleanor's words in her lap and Frank's unfinished deed beside her, Margaret was forced to face something more uncomfortable. Her parents had seen more than she thought. They had simply failed to act with the courage of what they knew. And Daniel, for all his selfishness, had not been untouched by shame. He had just chosen the kind of help that preserved distance and left Margaret alone with the kind that did not. A few days later, Margaret called Alicia and asked her to come by the house rather than meet at the office. They sat in the dining room with the windows open to a cool breeze. Margaret showed her the letters and the unsigned deed. Alicia read them slowly, then removed her glasses. "Well," she said at last, "this answers some questions." "It doesn't change the will," Margaret said. "No." "It doesn't stop the sale." "No." Margaret looked out at the lilacs beginning to bloom. "Then why does it feel like it changes everything?" Alicia considered her. "Because now you know your mother understood more than she admitted. And because you have proof that what happened wasn't as simple as your brother taking and you giving." Margaret gave a tired smile. "It still feels mostly like that." "I imagine it does." Alicia set the letters down carefully. "But there may be another question now. Not can you keep the house at any cost. Should you?" Margaret did not answer. That evening she called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring, wary. "Hello?" "I found some letters in the attic," Margaret said. Silence. "From Mom." Another silence, longer this time. "What kind of letters?" "The kind people write when they know they've made a mess and hope paper will be kinder than conversation." Daniel exhaled. "That sounds like Mom." Margaret leaned against the kitchen counter. "She kept the checks you sent." He said nothing. "She never told me. I asked her not to." Margaret closed her eyes. "Why?" "Because whatever I sent never looked like enough compared to what you were doing." There it was. Not apology, not exactly, but an opening where there had only been posture before. Margaret waited. Finally, Daniel said, "I knew if you found out, you'd either refuse to cash them or make me feel worse." She almost said that he should have felt worse. Instead, she asked, "Did you?" He laughed once, softly and without humor. "Margaret, I have felt worse for 20 years. The line went quiet except for distant traffic on his end. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Less polished. Older. "You think I don't know what you gave up? I do. I just never knew what to do with that knowledge. Every time I came home, you were already handling everything. Dad listened to you. Mom leaned on you. The house revolved around you. I told myself you wanted it that way because the other version was harder to live with." Margaret felt something tighten painfully in her chest. "What other version?" "That you got trapped," he said. "And I let it happen because leaving was easier than staying." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Outside the kitchen window, dusk thickened over the yard. The old screen door clicked in the breeze. At last Margaret said, "Then why push this hard? Why now?" He answered immediately, which told her he had been waiting for the question. "Because I'm in trouble, Margaret." He told her then, in stripped-down pieces, about the year he had been having. His company had merged and cut his position. He found another job quickly, but at lower pay. Rebecca's mother's care was expensive. Lily had been accepted to a graduate program they desperately wanted to support. The house in North Carolina had a second mortgage he should never have taken. None of this made him pitiable to Margaret. It did, however, make him legible. "I'm not asking you to save me," he said. Margaret looked around the kitchen that had witnessed so much asking disguised as necessity. "You are," she said quietly, "just not in words you like." He did not argue. They met the following Sunday at the house, alone. Daniel stood in the front hall with his hands in his coat pockets, looking older than Margaret remembered. The last few months had sharpened his face. For the first time in years, he seemed like someone no longer protected by charm. Margaret led him to the dining room. The letters lay on the table. He read Eleanor's letter to him first, then Margaret's, then the unsigned deed. At one point he took off his glasses and rubbed both eyes with the heel of his hand. When he finished, he sat for a long time staring at the wood grain beneath his fingers. "She really thought the house might have ruined your life," he said finally. Margaret gave a tired half laugh. "That would have been helpful information 20 years ago." Daniel looked up. "Did it?" Margaret considered the question more honestly than she might have a year earlier. "No," she said, "but I think being needed did. The house just made it easier to call that love." He nodded slowly. The sentence seemed to reach him in a place argument had never touched. They talked for nearly 3 hours. Not cleanly, not beautifully. There were still sharp moments, old grievances, defensiveness that flared and settled. Margaret told him what it had felt like to hear he was counting her years there as free rent. Daniel told her what it had felt like to come home and be treated like a visitor in the family he had fled because he did not know how to belong to it as a man. Margaret said no one had stopped him from building a separate life. Daniel said no one had ever taught him how to come back without shame. By the end, neither of them was innocent, but both were more recognizably human. The practical problem remained. Margaret still could not buy him out. Daniel still needed money. The house still stood between them like an inheritance too full of meaning to divide without damage. "What do you want to do?" Daniel asked at last. Margaret looked around the dining room. Afternoon light moved across the table. Eleanor's china cabinet glowed softly in the corner. On the far wall, a faint square marked where a landscape painting had hung for decades before Margaret packed it away after the funeral. For years she would have answered instantly, "Keep it." Now, with Eleanor's letter sitting open beside Frank's unfinished deed, the word no longer arrived so simply. "I want," Margaret said slowly, "for the next decision in my life not to be made out of fear." Daniel did not speak. Margaret folded her hands together. "I can keep fighting to stay here because I'm afraid letting go means none of what I did mattered. Or I can admit that maybe I stayed partly because I didn't know who I'd be without this house needing me." Daniel watched her carefully, as if afraid any interruption would close something fragile. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not only the brother who had hurt her, but the boy their mother had excused too often and understood too little. The man who learned to convert guilt into transactions, because that language gave him distance from the damage. "I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of saying you were right," she said. To her surprise, he smiled a little. "I wouldn't dare. But I am done pretending that keeping this place at all costs would heal anything." The sale took another 3 months. Margaret negotiated terms through Alicia and Karen, who was considerably gentler now that she understood more of the story, though not all of it. Daniel withdrew the most aggressive legal pressure. They agreed to delay listing until late summer, so Margaret could sort, donate, pack, and decide what to do with the things that made a house feel inhabited even when the furniture was gone. Recipe cards, half-burned candles, the blue bowl Eleanor set on the hall table every winter for mittens, the pencil marks inside the pantry door recording Lily's height during childhood visits. Word spread on Hawthorne Street, as it always did. Neighbors stopped by with cautious condolences, as if the house had received a diagnosis. June helped Margaret box books and wrap china. One afternoon, they sat cross-legged on the dining room floor, sorting Christmas ornaments, and June said, without looking up, "You know, Sometimes the brave thing isn't hanging on. It's admitting the thing you saved no longer knows how to save you back. Margaret smiled faintly. You and my dead mother ought to start a club. June laughed, and the sound eased something in the room. Daniel came up twice to help clear the attic and garage. They worked awkwardly at first, then more naturally. He carried out Frank's old paint cans. Margaret decided which tools to keep and which to donate. In a box marked camping, they found a Polaroid of themselves as children on the back porch. Daniel missing his front teeth, Margaret squinting into sunlight with one hand on his shoulder as if steadying him already. Daniel studied the photo a long time. You always looked older than me, he said. I was older than you. That's not what I mean. Margaret took the picture from him. In it, she was perhaps 14, already wearing the expression she would carry for most of her adult life. Not unhappy, exactly, but watchful. Responsible. No, she said. I know. There were practical sorrows she had expected, wrapping Eleanor's dishes in newspaper, choosing which winter coats to keep, hearing the upstairs rooms echo after the bookshelves were emptied. There were other sorrows she had not expected. The first night after Frank's armchair left, the living room looked so bare that Margaret stood in the doorway and could not cross the threshold. The day she removed the last linens from her parents' bedroom, the closet smelled briefly of Eleanor's soap, and she had to sit on the floor until the feeling passed. When Karen scheduled the photographer, Margaret nearly canceled the entire process. The thought of glossy images circulating online beneath phrases like charming colonial and timeless details felt obscene. In the end, she allowed it, but only after taking down the family photos. She would not let strangers inspect the faces, too. The open house was worse than she feared, and not for the reasons she imagined. The strangers were polite. They admired the crown molding, the built-ins, the garden. One woman ran her hand appreciatively along the banister Frank had made, and Margaret had to step outside before the sudden violence of her grief showed on her face. Daniel found her in the side yard, standing near the lilacs. I'm sorry, he said. Margaret crossed her arms. For what specifically? His mouth tightened. For making jokes when I should have known better. For the free rent comment. For acting like numbers were the only reality. She looked at him. He was trying, and she recognized how unusual that was for him. That's a decent start, she said. A little later, after the last prospective buyer left, they sat on the back steps drinking bad coffee from paper cups Karen had brought. Evening light softened the yard. The garden beds looked tired but still orderly. Beyond the fence, June waved once from her porch and went back inside. Daniel leaned his elbows on his knees. Rebecca says I should tell you I never wanted to hurt you this much. Margaret looked into her coffee. Did she phrase it exactly like that? He gave a low, brief laugh. No, Rebecca's version had more footnotes. Margaret nodded. The quiet between them no longer felt like open warfare. It did not feel easy either. Perhaps ease was no longer the goal. What did you want? She asked. Daniel took his time answering. Honestly, I wanted money. Then when you resisted, I wanted to win. Somewhere in there I stopped remembering those weren't the same thing. The honesty startled her by its plainness. And now? She said. He looked at the yard, at the kitchen window above them, at the house standing with its old dignity intact, despite all they had forced it to witness. Now I think we both inherited a family that asked the wrong things of us, he said. And then we asked them of each other. Margaret did not reply, but she remembered the sentence weeks later, because it was the closest either of them came to naming the truth without dressing it up. The house sold in September to a school counselor named Erin Solis and her husband Mark, who had 2 young sons and an unexpectedly reverent attitude toward old woodwork. Margaret met them only once before closing. Erin stood in the front hall looking around with damp eyes and said, "I know people say this about every old house, but this one feels loved." Margaret had braced herself for many reactions from buyers: enthusiasm, negotiation, intrusive optimism. She had not prepared for that one. "Yes," she said after a moment. "It was." Erin seemed to understand that this was not a conversation to expand. She only nodded. Closing took place in Alicia's office on a clear Tuesday morning. Margaret signed papers with a hand that remained steady until the very last page, when the finality of ink on legal forms suddenly struck with such force that she had to pause. Daniel, seated beside her, noticed and slid the tissue box a few inches closer without comment. When it was done, Alicia gathered the documents neatly. Karen shook hands. Daniel stood and looked uncertain, as if some ritual should follow, and he had no idea what it was. Margaret picked up the ring of house keys from the table. They seemed heavier than metal should. "Come with me," she said. He blinked. "Where?" "To the house." They drove separately. The September air had that first dry sharpness of approaching fall. Leaves skittered along the curb on Hawthorne Street. Margaret parked in the driveway one last time and went inside with Daniel behind her. The rooms were empty now. Without furniture, they looked both larger and more vulnerable, stripped of the arrangements that had made life seem anchored. Sound bounced oddly off the walls. Their footsteps followed them like a second pair. Margaret moved through the house slowly, not touching anything at first. In the living room, she stood where Frank's chair had been. In the kitchen, she looked at the table scar where Daniel had once carved his initials with a pocket knife, and Frank had pretended not to see because Eleanor liked the proof that children had happened there. In the downstairs bedroom, she stood for a long minute by the window where Eleanor used to watch sparrows in the feeder when pain kept her from sleeping. Daniel waited a respectful distance behind, hands in his coat pockets. Finally, they returned to the front hall. Margaret held the keys in her palm, the familiar weight pressed into her skin. "I thought this moment would feel like failure," she said. Daniel watched her. "It doesn't," she continued. "Not exactly." "What does it feel like?" She looked up the staircase at the afternoon light lying across the banister her father had built and she had polished through grief, anger, habit, and love. "It feels," she said slowly, "like putting down something I confused with duty for so long, I forgot it was also heavy." Daniel's face shifted. There was grief there and perhaps relief, and perhaps the first real understanding he had ever had of his sister as someone other than the role she served. "I'm sorry it took me this long," he said. Margaret met his eyes. "It took all of us too long." She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood looked ordinary. Mailbox flag raised across the street, someone mowing 2 houses down, sunlight on the Pattersons' hydrangeas. The world, indifferent and continuous, had already begun folding the day into itself. Margaret turned back once. The empty hall framed Daniel in partial shadow. For a second he looked like a younger man again, not in his face but in the uncertainty of his posture. She held out the keys. He shook his head. "You should do it." So Margaret crossed to the lock and placed the key in the deadbolt one final time. The mechanism turned with the same slight resistance it had always had in humid weather. When the latch clicked, The sound was small. Still, it marked the end of an era more completely than funerals had. Months later, Margaret rented a small brick duplex near the library, with a narrow kitchen, a stubborn radiator, and no room for inherited furniture except the oak sideboard from Eleanor's dining room and the little mantel clock that still lost 3 minutes every week. For the first several nights, she woke disoriented, listening for the house on Hawthorne Street, the groan of settling wood, the back fence gate in wind, the boiler cycling on. Instead, there was the hum of nearby traffic and the footsteps of a tenant upstairs who walked heavily after midnight. The new place did not feel like home right away. It felt like space, and because it was space, it also felt frightening. No parent needed medication. No contractor needed calling. No room carried an old emergency inside it. Margaret found herself standing in the unfamiliar kitchen some mornings with coffee in hand and a strange, almost guilty lightness in her chest, as if she had forgotten something urgent. Eventually, she understood that the urgent thing she had forgotten was only obligation. Daniel paid off part of his debts with the sale proceeds and, true to form, tried once to overcompensate by sending Margaret an expensive espresso machine she neither wanted nor had room for. She mailed it back with a note that said, in large block letters, "Call me like a normal person." To her own surprise, he did. Their relationship did not transform into some glowing late-life intimacy. That would have been dishonest. There were still limits, still old instincts, still years between them that no single season could repair. But they spoke more plainly now. They no longer used politeness as camouflage for resentment. At Thanksgiving, hosted at Rebecca's house for the first time in family history, Daniel asked Margaret whether she was tired before offering her the job of clearing plates. It was such a modest change that no one else would have noticed. Margaret noticed. So did he. As for the house, Margaret drove past once the following spring and saw bicycles in the driveway, chalk on the front walk, and a blue soccer ball lodged beneath the porch steps. The lilacs were blooming. One of Aaron Solis's boys had taped a paper star to the front window. Margaret sat at the curb for less than a minute, then drove on. She did not cry. That surprised her more than almost anything. Sometimes grief softens not because the thing lost mattered less, but because its meaning changes shape. Margaret had spent years believing the house was proof that her life had not disappeared into service. Losing it felt, at first, like losing the evidence. What she came to understand instead was harder and kinder at once. The years mattered whether or not the walls remained hers. The love had been real, even where it was tangled with duty. The harm had been real, even where no one intended it. And a house, no matter how carefully preserved, could not be asked to carry the full weight of a woman's unlived life. On certain evenings, when the light in her duplex turned warm and amber across the sideboard, Margaret would think of Eleanor's letter. Not the apology, though that mattered. Not even the unsigned deed, though it had once seemed like vindication. What stayed with her most was the line about mistaking strength for permission to ask more. It seemed to Margaret that whole families were built that way. The capable one absorbed, the charming one escaped, the worried one controlled, the silent one called it peace. And then, years later, everyone stood inside the ruins of those roles and wondered who had done this to them. Perhaps there was no single answer. Perhaps the best a person could do, late but sincerely, was refuse to keep repeating the arrangement. Margaret never received the full apology she might once have imagined, from her mother while alive, from her father for accepting too much, from Daniel for arriving at remorse only after damage had gone public. But she stopped waiting for those apologies to unlock the next part of her life. That, in the end, was its own inheritance. Some families break in one loud moment, over a will or a betrayal or the sale of a house. Others break slowly, over decades, through smaller habits no one names because naming them would require change. The Whitmores had done both. And yet what remained after the breaking was not only bitterness, there was also clarity. There was the hard-earned knowledge that love without recognition can become a burden, that sacrifice offered too long becomes expectation, and that letting go of the thing one spent years preserving is not always defeat. Sometimes it is the first honest act after a lifetime of endurance. In her new kitchen, Margaret began buying flowers for no occasion at all. Daisies, tulips, grocery store roses when they were cheap. She put them in a chipped white pitcher on the windowsill and watched them open in a room no one had ever been sick in. On weekends, she read novels she had shelved for others but never taken home. She signed up for a watercolor class at the community center and found she was mediocre at it, which turned out to be strangely delightful. No one needed her to be good. No one needed her to save anything. The freedom felt modest at first, almost too quiet to trust. Then one evening in late summer, while washing paint from her hands after class, Margaret caught sight of herself in the darkened kitchen window and realized she no longer looked like someone standing guard. She looked like someone finally living in a life that belonged, in whatever small and imperfect way, to her. And that was something no sale could take. In the end, this story reminds us that sometimes the very things we hold on to the hardest can also be the things God uses to change our hearts. What felt like loss can become the beginning of healing, and what seemed broken beyond repair can still carry the quiet touch of a miracle. In everyday life, many people are carrying silent burdens, family pain, disappointment, or sacrifices no one truly sees. But God sees every tear, every sleepless night, and every act of love that went unnoticed. And sometimes, when life closes one door, He opens another not to replace what was lost, but to lead us into peace we never thought we would find. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need this message today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from or what part of this story stayed with you, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. May God bless you, protect your home, bring peace to your family, and fill your life with strength, healing, and unexpected miracles.